But what about all the cool influencers we saw who, despite ego lifting, turned out absolutely wonderful, legends, historical figures? Well, in the muscle building world, I'm sure we've all seen the great wonders of the past, like Ronnie Coleman and Jay Cutler and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mike Mentzer, and they look very similar in terms of their physiques, but they were very different people. There's a lot of constants you'll find in these legends, from good diets to unfathomable intensity, remarkable knowledge, and sheer consistency. But one thing you'll notice does not remain constant is their technique. Some have the most world-class, pristine techniques, whereas others just did let it get a bit sloppy over the years. But at what point does poor technique here and there genuinely turn into a habit that could send our lifting journeys down the drain? We have to determine what's right and what's wrong. And with all the lies out there, we have to do it now. Because you're here to get healthy. We all are.
So we all live a life in the night. Pray to God, man, I hope I don't die. Been awake for days, so we all live a life.
So just like we always do, we have to make sure that we can accept a universal standard of what ego lifting is, because without this universal standard, we'll never be able to progress to answering the actual question. For example, consider these two clips. Both could be labeled ego lifting, both could be labeled at least decent technique, or there could be a difference. We have to standardize what we're looking at. Now, ego lifting for our purposes is going to be an instance where the muscle of intent is not the primary producer of force. These techniques are often biomechanically poor, leading to greater injury risk. For our purposes, we will assume a full range of motion because movements done only in the top half have proven to be inferior for gains. Now, a derivative but not the same thing as ego lifting is the concept of a cheat rep. These are reps where other means of force production may be used, but the muscle of intent is still the target muscle. There's also another excellent identifier you can use to separate the two. For someone performing cheat reps, they'll often have performed reps prior where their muscle was really the only means of force production contributing to the movement, indicating an ability to handle the weight itself. For ego lifting, these individuals will often be performing right from the beginning of the set reps where they clearly are not the main force producer. Not only is their technique rather poor, but they're not gaining much out of it either. If force production requirements are the primary stimulators of muscle growth, then how can anyone truly justify the fact that as you ego lift to a greater and greater extent, your performance is worse and your risks are much higher? But the thing is, very few people actually try to justify this type of ego lifting. It's another component of the spectrum, which is a very broad spectrum, by the way, where the real debate is. I don't think that there's a significant number of people, if any at all, who genuinely believe that as a regular gym goer, ego lifting is a genuinely acceptable method of training, just a flat-out go-to method. A lot of the debate and the issue centered around ego lifting is whether it should be performed more as a supplement to boost stimulus. In essence, similar to cheat reps, but instead of the muscle being the primary mover, it's momentum or some other factor. And here, the question does become somewhat nuanced and does require further explanation. The crux of the argument lies in performing repetitions with good technique, which always should be done, and then maybe even transitioning into cheat reps for additional stimulus, but then further going to some ego lifting reps for even more stimulus. It poses a valid question, and you've seen bodybuilders do this all the time, because no muscular stimulus is sacrificed since good form reps are already being done. So the only way to actually analyze what we should do is to compare what we gain and what we lose. Every single answer in the gym is based on precision. And for ego lifting, this is exactly the case, and we have to analyze it with hyper focus on the arguments from all sides. So outside of looking impressive, the argued pros are additional stimulus, and the cons are higher injury risk, limited strength gains, and excess limiting factors. Let's focus on the cons for just 1 second. Ego lifting often uses other means of force production like momentum because a depleted muscle at the end of a set is just too, well, depleted to control the weight. This places unnecessary and avoidable pressure on the joints, and while the risk for a major injury is quite small, to be frank, this does lead to a faster deterioration of physical health over time due to the undue pressure. Additionally, really pushing past ideal limits with ego lifting can carry into the next sets, with the cardio becoming a limiting factor. Also, not to mention that the muscular stimulus you do receive from ego lifting is less than ideal to begin with. So does that little bit of extra stimulus actually outweigh all the cons you just mentioned? Well, we can turn to none other than science for answers, because there's been a lot of studies done. The first graph we looked at earlier in the video highlighted the risks with doing ego lifting as your primary method of training, and that's just poor. There's not even an intelligent discussion to be had there, so we're not going to focus on it. But what about our new scenario? In our case, we have to determine if the idea of ego lifting after we've completed a proper set is beneficial for our gains. I know the pursuit of more hardcore training, intensity, does sound absolutely wonderful, and yes, intensity does drive gains in the gym, but the research does show that 3 to 5 reps shy of failure is actually pretty ideal for stimulus, meaning that anything past that is really not statistically significant in terms of producing more muscle gains. Training all the way to failure should produce relatively equal results than training just a few rep shots. Obviously, it's never a bad thing to go all the way to failure, but that's only if we do it with proper form where the muscle is the limiter. However, if we examine studies that analyze the injury risks, they do show statistical significance if we were to ego lift. And one study found something very interesting. Ego lifting gave the same stimulus as stricter form only when the weight was heavier, meaning that the overall effect provided by ego lifting was less from a pure efficiency standpoint. But what about all the cool influencers we saw who, despite ego lifting, turned out absolutely wonderful, legends, historical figures? Well, in the muscle building world, you know and I know there's multiple factors beyond technique. Steroids, genetics, injury history, all combine with your technique to form one cohesive unit, which is you. And also, couldn't the same thing be said about cheat reps, or the number of techniques people use to go beyond failure, such as drop sets, mile reps, or rest pause? Well, theoretically, sure. Perhaps those few extra efforts won't give you the largest added boost in the gym, but they also won't provide you any harm. Because all of these techniques prioritize the muscular stimulus first, they can be safely assured that both from an efficiency standpoint and biomechanical standpoint, there's relatively no harm. Intensity is important. In fact, it's likely the most important factor. But that doesn't mean that analytical consideration should be thrown out of the window. When making an informed decision, every side of every argument must be analyzed and assessed correctly, and then we can progress forward with the evidence we have.